This video was made for the grade 12 students in the South African IEB curriculum to assist them with revision for their final examinations. The poem is prescribed for English home language students in the 2020 to 2022 cycle. Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen is one of the most famous war poems written during what we now call World War I. At the time, it was called the Great War, and was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. A brief comment on pronunciation. The title of the poem is from a well-known quote by the Latin poet Horace. When I did Latin as a high school subject in the late 1970s, all C's were pronounced as a hard K, and my formidable teacher, Miss Jean Urey, drummed this into my head. So I will pronounce the title as Dulce et Decorum Est. There will be other teachers who pronounce it in the more Italian way as Dulce et Decorum Est. Both of these are acceptable pronunciations. Consider the image that I have selected for the introductory slides. It's from a painting entitled Gassed. It's a very large oil painting completed in March 1919 by John Singer Sargent and depicts the aftermath of a mustard gas attack during the First World War. You can see a line of wounded soldiers walking towards a dressing station. The poet Wilfred Owen was born into a typical English family. He was a writer from an early age. As a young adult, he attempted a career in religious life in the Church of England. He didn't enjoy it and returned home wondering what his future held. War was declared in 1914. Owen enlisted and, like so many of his compatriots, was wounded in combat. He was shipped to Scotland to recover and in hospital met another writer, Siegfried Sassoon. The two soldiers spent much time reading and revising their work, most of which had to do with the horrors of war that they were enduring firsthand. Both men suffered from shell shock, what we today call PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite this, both returned to the front lines to continue fighting. Of course, by now you would have noticed Owen's year of death. 1918. He was killed in action exactly 1 week before peace was declared. The irony of his death in battle, so close to the end of the Great War, is obvious. Owen was posthumously given the rank of lieutenant and awarded the Military Cross for courage. His poems were collated and today are studied all over the world. He is a key figure in what came to be known as the war poets movement in English literature. Enlisted men were not professional soldiers and had not trained for the horrors of war. Some put their thoughts on paper, and many of the poems are collected in respected anthologies. Look out for documentaries, such as this one, which go a long way to allow us in the 21st century to have some inkling of the horrors these men faced. In the British centenary commemorations of World War I, a number of statues were erected to honor these war poets. This is one of Wilfred Owen in his hometown in Shropshire. And this one, with a soldier burying his face in his hands, is in Liverpool. On the plinth of the statue is another of Owen's poems, Futility. I do recommend that you read it. And finally, although he was not buried in Westminster Abbey, Wilfred Owen and other war poets are commemorated with this marble gravestone. The words in red are a quote from Wilfred Owen, and the names alongside his are the names of these British war poets, not all of whom died in combat, but who were marked by the experience for the rest of their lives. Wilfred Owen fully expected to die in combat, but he wrote that his death would have meaning. His death, he wrote, would be a protest. I like to think that his inclusion in your poetry curriculum would please this man of words, that his words have had the power to stay the course of 100 years. He wrote about this meaning of his poems himself, stating that his subject is the pity of war. He intended his poems to be a warning to those who read them, and in order to convey this warning, he says, he must write truthfully. And the content of this poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, is brutal in its honesty. So the man is gone, this soldier who was anti-war, a pacifist icon, but his words remain. Let's read the poem and see if we understand the truth about the pity of war as penned by Wilfred Owen. When Owen first wrote this poem, he called it the gas poem. Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. Before we get into a line-by-line analysis, think about the concept of enlistment. It's 1914 and politicians have messed up again, and war is declared between two countries. Your government starts a propaganda campaign with posters and other media encouraging all able-bodied men to enlist. You are subtly told that you're a coward if you don't. You're not a team player. You're not a patriot. So you join, probably with some of your mates. You get your kit and off you go to fight in another country about policies that you don't fully understand. And on the other side, the same has happened. The enemy soldiers have been convinced to fight against you. So you do. If you don't shoot first, they'll shoot you. The result? There are no winners. If you do make it home, you are damaged forever. Shell shock will impact your mental health until the day you die. Was it worth it? Wilfred Owen in this poem states emphatically that it isn't worth it. at all. The poem describes three separate experiences: a march away from the trenches of battle, a lethal gas attack, and the resulting post-traumatic stress that every soldier who has seen combat will encounter. The first stanza describes the impossible conditions under which soldiers toiled at the front lines. The reader is dumped straight into the misery without introduction or explanation. The soldiers are described as looking like beggars, bent double, even though they are not actually carrying heavy sacks. They are exhausted, so much so that they walk with knock knees and are coughing like old women. The men curse their way through the mud and muck of the trenches. You will note that Owen has made use of two similes here to compare the exhausted soldiers to old beggars and hags. This stark clinical imagery is characteristic of Owen's poetry. He has also made use of alliteration to add to the harshness of the scene, particularly with the plosive b sounds. And watch out for the alliteration of the d sounds in the poem. There are many of them. And the rhythm of these lines is regular, to mirror the somnambulist marching of the exhausted men. The men are trudging towards their resting place. This verb denotes a world weariness, men walking with heavy steps, turning their backs to the battlefield. Behind them are the haunting flares. To stop British night patrols, the Germans used flares which blazed brightly for a minute, giving the defending troops a chance to kill any advancing soldiers. It's interesting to note that in the original manuscript, Owen first used the adjective clawing to describe the flares. He changed the word to haunting, which you'll agree enhances the otherworldly imagery of the poem. These men are in a nightmare while awake. They are haunted by horror as they march. The words "we turned our backs" can be interpreted both literally and figuratively. The men are leaving the battlefield, but they could also be turning their backs on the belief that they are doing their patriotic duty by fighting in this war. The last lines of the poem will support this view. The remainder of stanza 1 continues with a description of the men marching, almost as though they are sleepwalking. They are in a poor physical state. Many had lost their boots, and instead of wearing boots, their feet are blood-shod. In other words, their own blood has replaced their boots, resulting in their limping, lame gait. This condition was known as trench foot and was a common affliction of the soldiers in World War I. The imagery is deliberately shocking. Owen takes us into the trenches with him. And their exhaustion is such that they appear drunk. They are so fatigued that they don't hear the sounds of 5.9s, the artillery shells that are dropping behind them. It's as though they simply don't care about their fate anymore. In some versions of the poem, the words 5.9s have been changed to shells, but by keeping the technical term, 5.9s refer to the size of the shells fired by this German gun. They were 5.9 inches in diameter. The poem has credibility, authenticity, and the use of alliteration is continued, adding to the rhythm and meter of the lines. In stanza 2, we bear witness to the gassing that was used so ruthlessly in the First World War, the first time that chemical weapons were used to such devastating effect. You'll notice the use of exclamation marks to convey the sense of panic and urgency as the soldiers realize what is happening to them. The word gas is repeated, and in some copies of the poem, the second gas is printed in capital letters, also to show the suddenness of the attack. The 4 monosyllabic words here disrupt the rhythm of the lines, a very effective way to illustrate the suddenness of the attack. This is followed by a long dash. Its correct name is an M dash. This punctuation mark is used to clarify a concept or to add extra focus to an explanation. The reader is certainly drawn into this scene. These hapless young men have to race against time to fit their gas helmets. In World War I, these were bulky items, awkward to handle, and if you were too slow, your death was almost certain. And the diction here is noteworthy. The abstract noun ecstasy is incongruous in this context. The reader imagines a frenzied attempt to get the helmets out and on their heads in time, and for the successful, it is a relieved joy. When Owen was editing the poem, his friend and fellow poet Sigrid Sassoon put a question mark next to the word ecstasy. Owen insisted on keeping the word, explaining that he was using the Greek etymology, ek, meaning out of, and stasis, meaning a position, a standing. He was emphasizing that this seemed to be an out-of-body experience. And you'll also notice the alliteration here, the repetition of the f sound in fumbling and fitting. This alliteration slows down the pace of the lines, highlighting the soldiers' fatigued response to the emergency in which they find themselves. And the poet makes use of a transferred epithet with clumsy. It's not the helmets that are clumsy, it's the panicking soldiers in their exhausted state, racing against time to save themselves from the effects of the mustard gas. Line 11 starts with the conjunction but, signifying a shift, a change in circumstances for one of the soldiers. He was not quick enough to put on his mask and ends up yelling, stumbling and floundering, desperate to escape the lethal fumes of the gas, as though he were burning in flames or drowning in lime, a chemical powder used as an ingredient in the making of these chemical weapons. Each of these verbs is in the present participle or gerundive format with the ing ending. This makes the scene immediate or current in its horror. The ellipsis leaves the reader to imagine the fate of this soldier. It's an unfinished thought. The scene is just too horrific to describe. The use of similes creates an image of the victim drowning under a green sea. The speaker in the poem already has on his gas mask, so he sees his floundering comrade as though through a pane of glass, the see-through panel of his mask. The chemical gave off a green, smoky substance, bathing the surroundings in an eerie green light. The description of the gas is almost tactile. It can be felt in every possible sense. The lone soldier desperately reaches out for help, to no avail. In many of the poems and texts that you read, particularly Shakespeare, you'll come across words that have an apostrophe to indicate the omission of letters. Now, floundering here is missing an E. Why has the poet taken it out? The answer is to do with the rhythm of the line. By removing the letter E here, the poet has decreased the number of syllables in the line by 1 in order to maintain the integrity of the formal rhythm. We'll look at this in more detail in a later slide. It's difficult for us to imagine this scene. We have never been in combat. The desperate plight of this soldier is almost just too terrible to contemplate. These 2 lines illustrate the mental damage done to the speaker. the sight of his comrade dying a slow and painful death as a result of a gas attack is not a sight that can be left on the battlefield. Owen recalls this reality as, in all my dreams before my helpless sight, it is the stuff of nightmares. The poet has deliberately blurred the lines between reality and dream, sleep and being awake, to reflect the troubled mental state, the nightmares of soldiers who have lost check with reality. In these lines, Owen powerfully documents the terrible death of the unmasked soldier. His diction is deliberate. We should be filled with dread reading as this soldier plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. The rule of three rhythm here, still using the present participle format of the verbs, starkly emphasizes the cruel and painful death of Owen's comrade. The description of the man plunging towards the speaker develops the imagery of a man drowning. The word that hits me the hardest here is helpless. There is absolutely nothing that the speaker can do to save his comrade. In line 17, the reader is invited into this nightmare scene. The poet addresses you, the reader, directly. It should make you feel uncomfortable, almost unwilling to participate in this scene, even if you are safely on the other side of the page. The poet continues with the imagery of dreams, nightmares. He is unflinching with his diction, using the harshest descriptions to convey the gruesome ghastliness of war. He asks you to imagine what it was like to walk behind the wagon into which the dying man was flung. Flung? That means to throw or hurl something forcefully. This man is not treated gently, with compassion. There's no time for such nicety, such compassion in war. He is treated like something dispensable, like garbage. The description of the dying man's last moments are brutal. We have those present participles again. The man is smothering, writhing, hanging. He is in his death throes, and there is nothing dignified in the manner of his death. It is a terrifying scene, one that you would expect to find in hell, hence the simile comparing his face to that of a devil who is sick of sin. You'll agree that this description is nauseating. The diction is unrelenting. There is no way that the reader can escape this brutality. The alliteration, the rhythm, all ensures that the mental image created by the poet will be seared on our brains. The next four lines continue with a relentless assault on our senses. The speaker describes the scene he witnessed in unambiguous terms. There's a growing sense of anger and bitterness as he tells of the blood gargling from the lungs of the victim and the vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. The harsh similes intensify this anger and bitterness. Cud is the matter chewed repeatedly by cattle. The scene will be regurgitated, repeated, and these injuries suffered by soldiers are grotesquely devastating. These photographs are of real World War I victims. They are indeed obscene, bitter, and vile, more so because the young casualties are innocent and their injuries are incurable. The M dash at the end indicates a transition. We are coming to the message, the purpose of this poem in its final lines. In the final lines, Owen subverts the idea that going to war is a glorious act and that representing your country in battle is just. By putting the reader in the shoes and mind of a soldier in the trenches, he powerfully convinces the reader to appreciate the inglorious, the sheer horror of war. The speaker challenges the reader to consider the hypocrisy of conscripting young men, knowing full well that they are likely to die in battle for causes that make no sense to them. This famous World War I propaganda poster was one of the most successful. It resulted in numbers of men volunteering for service, playing on their sense of guilt, the idea that they should be willing to sacrifice some time in order to face their children afterwards with pride. And when a man died in battle, he was said to have made the ultimate sacrifice. This poster tries to give the senseless deaths of men in the trenches some meaning, some significance. The newspapers of the day were filled with reports such as these, implying that the young men willingly gave their lives for their countries. Owen calls this out as a fraud, a lie, hence the capital letter L here. Owen takes a well-known Latin quote and turns it on its head. He has proven through his own experiences that it is not sweet and fitting for a man to die for his country. He firmly rejects this concept of honor and patriotism. The words zest and ardent compound the desperation of the false glory that is sought. War is not life-affirming at all. This is a stunning anti-war poem. The quote is from the writing of Horace, a Roman poet, and is taken from his odes. In the third ode, we read that it is sweet, Dulce, and meet or fitting, Decorum, to die, mori, for your country, patria. It's very likely that Owen's poem, and in particular the last 4 lines, were addressed to another poet, Jessie Pope, who wrote in favor of the war, including her well-known poem, The Call, in which she asks, who's fretting to begin, who's going out to win? Wilfred Owen's experience proved to him that this was a wicked lie, that no sacrifice was worth the empire's thanks. During the apartheid years in South Africa, white men were conscripted into what was then the South African Defence Force. On completion of their forced service, they were given a Pro Patria medal for, in the words of that time, contributing to the suppression or prevention of terrorism in defence of South Africa. Many of the men who got these medals will identify with the words of this poem, as many of them feel that they were fed a lie and had to endure terrible experiences in the service of a government that had betrayed them and the people of South Africa. In war, there are no winners. The poem is written in blank verse and contains 4 unequal stanzas. Owen uses the language of war with flares, gas, shells, helmets, to help the reader see what Owen saw firsthand as a soldier. He contrasts this with the language of the human body. The soldiers' backs, face, lungs, tongues are referenced to help the reader recognize the frailty of the human condition while trying to survive in a violent and unforgiving environment. And you'll be aware of the short sounds, the heavy monosyllabic words with the emphasis on the vowels in the first stanza, to the longer guttural words in the lines describing the gas attack. All of these words add to the sense of realism. Owen is able to do more than paint a vivid and troubling image of soldiering. He is forceful in his anti-war sentiment, which is delivered with this structured rhyme and rhythm. The poem follows an AB alternating rhyme scheme, as evidenced by the end rhyming of sacks, backs, sludge, trudge, boots, hoots, for example. This rhyme scheme continues till the end, using varied iambic pentameter, where the third last line of glory rhymes with the last line, the last word of Roman poet Horace's Pro Patria Mori. This blank verse poem tells, in matter-of-fact terms, the story of one soldier's experience of war. And from what we know of Owen's life and death, we can infer that the poem is semi-autobiographical. And Owen's purpose is clear: to reveal war for what it is. Of course, there is the irony that a man who volunteered for service, who was wounded, promoted, and rewarded for his courage under fire, should expose the powers that be in such a brutal and uncompromising fashion. Now, when you look at this quote again, I think you'll understand what Owen meant about his death being the only place from which he could protest. When Wilfred Owen was being treated for shell shock at the Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh in 1917, he encountered this painting for the first time, and it impressed him profoundly. The name of the painting is Avatar, and it is a meditation on the fallen of the Great War, painted by Henry Lintott in 1916. Wilfred Owen described this depiction of angels carrying the body of a fallen warrior towards the heavens as the finest picture now in the Edinburgh Gallery. This painting was rarely exhibited, but in 2015, as part of the centenary commemorations of World War I, the painting was again put on display at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. And after reading the poem, can you see echoes of this picture in Owen's words? And also, while Owen was recovering at the Craig Lockhart Hospital, he would have read and contributed to this magazine that was issued by the patients in the hospital called the Hydra. And I'm sure that you've seen enough war movies and played enough online games to recognize Hydra as the multi-headed snake-like monster who is immortal. I like to think that Owen was inspired by this too, that he saw the menace of politicians and the games they play with men's lives as being akin to this mythological monster with its insatiable desire for murder and mayhem. Pause a moment and look at the detail on the cover. Do you see the two nurses standing on either side, while a man is blasted from the battleground into the tentacles of the Hydra monster? It's a combination of realism and fantasy, very like the poem itself. As an IEB student, you know that you can expect an unseen poem paired with a seen poem. For Dulce et Decorum Est, I suggest that you read at least 2 other Wilfred Owen poems. There are many, but I recommend Futility, The Send-Off, and Anthem for Doomed Youth. You might well have studied these in earlier years. See if you can find your old poetry notes. You can also expect a different type of text to be paired with the poem, such as this quote, which we have already looked at in earlier slides in this presentation. And ask yourself the big questions. Why do we still go to war? Why don't we pay attention to the words of people like Wilfred Owen, who experienced firsthand the horrors of combat? Who benefits from wars? And if our country declared war on another nation, would you enlist? We go back now to the painting that I chose for the opening slides. After reading Owen's poem and hopefully picturing his images yourself, what do you see when you look at this painting? Take a moment to really study it. Is this an effective anti-war statement? Does it do justice to Owen's words? Do you get the sense of an ecstasy of fumbling when you look at this rather orderly group of soldiers? And is the horror of the poem evident here? What do you think? I hope that you all get to travel in your futures. Make an effort to get to the Imperial War Museum in London, where you will see the original painting on display. Set aside a day for the excursion and contemplate the many wars that humans have started. We seem to be so good at starting wars, but we are no good at ending them. And while we're looking at things historical, I find this image particularly moving. It's a photograph of one of the drafts of the original poem, as written by Wilfred Owen while convalescing at Craiglockhart Hospital. And here we see his revisions, his editing of his writing. From a hospital for the wounded to the battlefields of Europe, in an envelope to his mother, and to your matric poetry anthology. This piece of paper has made quite a journey, hasn't it? That's it for now. Another poem revised for your final exams. It's here that I would like to pay tribute to one of my former teachers. The formidable Miss Jean Urie was both my Latin teacher and headmistress at Wynberg Girls High in Cape Town. She demanded excellence and hard work from all of her students. And I was fortunate to have had this kind of input in my life at a young age. It's been 40 or so years since I matriculated, but I'll never forget some of the amazing teachers like Miss Urie, who inspired and challenged me to give of my best at all times.